Hall & Wilcox acknowledges the traditional custodians of the lands on which this podcast is recorded. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and to all First Nations people joining us today.
Hello, and welcome to our podcast on health and aged care. In this series, we're examining the key issues that face providers in the aged care sector. My name is Alison Choi Flanagan, and I'm a partner of Hall & Wilcox, and I co-head their health and care group. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by my colleague and fellow partner, Mark Petrucco, from our Commercial Disputes Resolution group, and our guest, Anthony Connolly from McGrath-Nicol. Anthony has more than 26 years of advisory, structuring and insolvency experience. Anthony regularly undertakes large and complex formal restructuring arrangements and is chair of the McGrath-Nicol's National Risk Committee and partner in charge of their Christmas office. So welcome to you both. In today's episode, we're going to be discussing restructuring in the aged care setting. Let's start with a question for Anthony. So what are the trends that you are seeing in the financial performance of approved providers, Anthony?
Thanks, Alison. In short, the key theme we continue to see is the pace of change. And that includes things like regular changes to funding models, such as the change from ACFI to ANAC, and then increases in that over time. Pay rates of certain staff, particularly classifications in the care parts of the business, have also seen material uplifts in the last 12 months or so. And then you combine that with really significant shifts in input costs in matters really broad, including consumables, IT and telephony, specialist equipment, and right through to food and beverage. So many of these were also impacted by supply chain issues and challenges, both through COVID and beyond, and that affected both availability and cost. So you add all of that to general inflationary pressures, which have been well documented, and it's been really quite challenging. Of course, to add to all of that, the cost of any building or refurbishment works, if required, are also really hard to nail down, which is a widely publicised issue in construction and trades. So across all of those issues, there's a lot going on and quite a lot to think about.
Notice that with the exposure draft of the aged care bill, there's going to be a lot of increased obligations on approved providers in terms of statutory duties and potential higher compensation. So are you seeing that as some of the approved providers concerned about that in terms of their personal liability? And are they looking for options on their future business and potentially restructuring as a result of that?
We are. And what we're finding is that a lot of boards that were built from community engagement and well-meaning people are finding that some of those duties are beyond what they're prepared to accept. And what that has led certain providers to do is to think about things like compartmentalising their business, moving the aged care part of it into a specific legal entity and constituting a new board. And that might be a sensible outcome, but there's a lot of friction involved in that. Anytime you move assets and businesses around, it can be challenging. There's a lot of broad legal, commercial and financial issues to bear in mind, not to mention touch points with third parties, including financiers and others. So there's a lot to think about, but certainly we have seen that start to play through.
What sort of things that should the boards be considering when they're looking at those options?
The responses available to boards aren't new, but they're far more important than ever. And I would recommend, in any case, the key management tool is a dynamic financial model. Building such a model allows a board to explore matters such as alternative revenue streams, examining the impact of cost reduction strategies and everything in between. So as an example, we've seen some providers make use of things like commercial businesses that sit alongside their aged care business. Some have co-located their residential aged care, home care, retirement village, and even affordable housing, with the idea that the effective sharing of costs allows you to reduce costs overall. But first, before you consider any changes, you've got to make sure that any financial model is anchored to reality. You've got to make sure that all of your working capital items, so current assets, current liabilities, actually match the true position. Then you can actually use a model like that to predict the future, to measure the impact of various changes that might be made on both the balance sheet and the P&L. So if you assume there's a level, large or small, of financial distress or challenge, one of the first tasks is to work out what the length of the runway is. How long does the business have before there's a real cash crunch? Once you know that, you can use a financial model to identify the potential impact of changes to firstly extend that runway, and secondly, to work out whether there is in fact a viable future state. Look, in some cases, what we've seen is the best option is actually transactional, where certain assets or business units might be sold and that capital recycled back into the profitable parts of the business, or indeed put into debt reduction.
The Australian government has published their final report on the aged care task force, and some of those recommendations mean that they're going to be, potentially looking at the role of RADs going forward. So I think boards should be looking at, what the regulatory reforms are and feeding that into their business modelling, particularly if they're going to refinance. Would you agree, Anthony?
I would, and I find that having a financier who understands these issues is critical. Certain financiers in the sector are really across that issue and they understand the movements over time, both historical and potential future. Others might struggle. So making sure that not only the true board of directors, but almost the shadow board of directors, if you will, so the people who are the advisors to you, the people who can help you navigate through that. And that includes your financiers. That's actually really important.
Anthony, we were just talking about, a lot of approved providers, as we know from the reports, are actually struggling financially. So, Mark, what can approved providers do in terms of debt collection? And we know it's highly regulated with the security of tenure requirements.
Thanks, Alison. Yes, I know the focus of discussion is not going to look at security of tenure, but it has an integral part to play in how the arrangements are put in place with residents. And it really starts from the outset of the relationship. The residential agreements ought to be clear and actually provide the gamut of obligations on both sides of the contracting parties. It should set out the terms of payment, whether there are mechanisms for prepayments if permissible under the rules, deductions, automatic debits, if security is to be provided. The agreement should be clear and compliant with not just the laws and regulations concerning healthcare, but also the Australian consumer law, that you don't fall into a trap that it's a standard form contract. It's got to be legible and understandable. If the documents are being signed under power of attorney, that those suites of documents are also cited at the time of execution at the commencement of the relationship. And copies of those documents, preferably certified copies, are held by the provider as part of its record keeping. So if there's ever a need to call up the document to see that the contract has been properly executed by a party with due authority, and certainly if there are real property that is held in joint names or in the name of the resident, joint names including the resident, there are mechanisms that can be deployed to actually provide safeguards for collection of debts.
Clients, as a matter of course, require guarantees, so personal guarantees when residents enter the facility as well, and perhaps caveats. Are there any other tips for boards and senior managers in relation to securing the financial payment of residents and the financial viability of the entity?
Yeah, no, sure. Good question, Alison. I did mention ensuring that the agreement sets out the securities that might be proffered as supporting the obligations of the resident and payment. You've touched on a couple of key ones, guarantees, and the guarantee can be provided by a third party so that payments are made if called upon. Also, direct debit from the accounts of the resident and or the guarantor, bank accounts. If there is real property, that there is a sufficiently drafted charging clause in the agreement that grounds a right to the provider to lodge a caveat, and that the caveat acts as a notice to the world that there is a charging clause under the residential agreement in respect of the resident's interest in that property. Now, that doesn't necessarily translate into immediate payment because it might take some time until the property is realised, but then it gives you the safeguard of repayment of the total amount due, provided there's sufficient equity in the property. Those will be the key steps that can be done to protect, or adequately protect, the provider for recovery of debts that become due or overdue.
Directors have obligations under the common law, if you're for profit, the Corporations Act, if you're not for profit, the ACNC Act, to ensure solvency of the approved provider. What do you think, Anthony, are some of the proactive steps that boards can take about, the financial challenges that the organisation faces, or how can boards comply with their duty of solvency?
Thanks for that. This answer might sound trite, but it's really true. Don't put your head in the sand. Einstein was right when he said, doing the same thing yesterday and today and expecting a different result is the very definition of insanity. A really key point is to speak to advisors. We've talked already about getting a financial model prepared so that you can effectively predict what might be the impact of changes you might make. Don't slow down, because if there's a certain runway, you don't want to burn it up. A really key consideration, though, is the law of unintended consequences. Anytime you try to foresee the future and make changes to get there, inevitably there's something you didn't think about. There's something you can't predict. An example is the human impact. Entities we've worked with in the sector often find that the pace of change required to implement to ensure financial viability actually creates massive change fatigue for the human people in the business. And bearing in mind that in many cases, the human cost of the business is often the largest, so wages might be north of 70% of all costs. If you say you're going to cut costs, you are necessarily saying you're going to cut people. So being honest and authentic about that's actually incredibly important. But then also bear in mind, if you're saying that and then saying to those very same people, please lean into this change because it's vital to financial survival, that's discordant. So don't try and get around that. Just acknowledge that and accept it. And also accept that the best plan must allow for adjustments. And that might include slowing down change if there's any risk that you might end up with people whose hearts and minds are left behind. There's obviously certain metrics that can't be controlled. One of the key things is to control the controllables. As we've mentioned, key is to take advice through no fault of their own. Senior people in a business that's in financial distress can find it really confronting to lift their minds from business as usual up to the horizon line. External advisors can really help do that, can help them to stop focusing on the minutiae and get up to the really strategic level. Having an advisor who can help you lift that gaze is going to be pivotal.
Alison, if I can just add to Anthony's helpful comments, under the Corporations Act, there is a definition of solvency, and solvency is essentially an entity, a corporation that's able to meet its debts as and when they fall due. Now, that rather obtuse definition is read differently in the court cases. Court cases, when determining solvency issues, look at the company's financial performance. They'll assess the balance sheet, but the true indicia is the cash flow test. So the law requires the directors to monitor and look closely at their cash flow and their forecasting to ensure that the foreseeable runway, this is back to Anthony's point, looking to the horizon, that there is the ability to meet debts as and when they fall due. And that's a critical little point that many directors, not necessarily confined to the healthcare sector, but many directors in industry and business fail to appreciate. Well, they'll say, well, I've got this fabulous balance sheet and I'm solvent. But it's a question of actually, can you unlock the liquidity that might be tied in the balance sheets in those current assets to be able to fund the business going forward? And that is not necessarily an easy step to take, or may require external professional advisors how to navigate those steps successfully.
I know that I haven't given you much notice about this question, but it sort of leads itself into it. Do you just want to talk a little bit about safe harbour and what that is?
Sure thing. The safe harbour is a carve-out or a defence from the standard insolvent trading regime, which broadly holds that directors of companies who cause a company to incur debts when they know or ought to know that the company is insolvent and therefore can't pay those debts can themselves be made personally liable to pay the amounts. Safe harbour is an exception to that, and what it says broadly is that a director who begins to take steps at a point where they fear the company might be insolvent, and those steps are designed to lead to a better outcome for the company as a whole compared to the immediate winding up, they can leave that evidence as a defence if the entity is subsequently wound up and a liquidator chases them for insolvent trading. Regrettably, there's no case law on that section yet, but there is plenty of commentary on what it might mean. I would suggest that the most important part of that is not just having a plan at the start, but ongoing monitoring. And most commentators, and probably in due course, the bench will say that. What's really important is that you have a plan that is likely to lead to the ongoing financial viability of the entity. It's got to be rational and reasonable. And there are some other threshold tests, including reporting your taxes, paying your employees, and keeping proper records. If all of that can line up, then it may well be a sensible defence. But again, I come back to the key point, there has to be a reasonable chance of survival. The way I'd put it is a lot of providers we deal with can often see a future state where they're viable and financially sustainable. But it's like it's on the other side of a canyon and you've got to have a bridge to get there. And often that bridge will involve making substantial changes to the entity, changing the debt funding position, and sometimes transactions. The safe harbour regime might just be a method of putting some guardrails around the bridge that gets you from one side of the canyon to the other so that if things don't quite go to plan, you don't fall into the canyon.
Just one quick aspect to Anthony's comment. Those provisions pertaining to safe harbour are found in the Corporations Act. And one of the key points is that the board of directors of the distressed company or company that can see that there may be cash flow issues imminent engages with a suitably qualified professional. And that suitably qualified professional would be someone with the requisite experience and expertise in restructuring so as to be able to assist in advising the board as to what the plan that is being implemented or plans. It could be a couple of irons in the fire that are being deployed to find a restructuring of the business that is that would deliver a better outcome than if a liquidator were appointed at that point. Now, one other little aspect that safe harbour entails is that it's a confidential process. Unlike external administration, whether it be voluntary administration, receivership or liquidation, public policy dictates that all the world is notified of the company's position as distressed, that you know that you're dealing with a company that's under external administration. Whereas safe harbour, it is a confidential process, although dealings with major stakeholders need to be brought into the tent to understand the process going forward. For instance, maybe a secured creditor or key shareholders in the business. I know it's not the focus of this discussion, but there is a notation in the ASX rules about when a listed entity goes into safe harbour and what levels of disclosure are required, and it's kept to a minimum so that there's not a run on the company or that people don't dump stock, causing it detriment as a consequence of it being in safe harbour.
Anthony, what other tips do you have for boards and senior managers in a situation where they're concerned about the ongoing financial viability of their entity?
I think we've covered the key steps, but maybe if I can use this opportunity to recap them. The first is pay attention, don't stick your head in the sand. The second thing is to take advice, and picking up on what Mark just said, from appropriately qualified advisors. The third thing is to ensure that they have a vision of what the future might be, and that is often through the use of a dynamic financial model. Using that model to identify what changes are required to move the entity from unsustainable or unviable back to sustainable and viable to ensure that it can in fact continue to provide services into the future. Then taking steps to communicate clearly with stakeholders, including staff and external parties, around how you're going to get from point A to point B. Effecting that plan over time and monitoring it continually to ensure that if changes are required, those changes are made, that the hearts and minds of internal and external stakeholders don't get left behind. If all of that is followed, we have seen some really great stories of entities moving from a position where they were at risk of failure to not failing and in fact continuing to provide services, sometimes differently, often better, and sometimes through consolidating different parts of their business, cycling capital from one place to another, repaying debts and restoring viability. It can be done. It's not easy, and often it's a real important step is making sure that staff come with you. But if you can achieve all of that, it is in fact possible.
Mark, do you have anything to add to that?
I know, I think Anthony has succinctly and importantly recapped on the key points. I would just underscore the importance of monitoring the financial trading of the business and what are its commitments, short-term, medium-term, and that there is cash flow available to meet those commitments.
Yeah, things that I've learnt about that, what you've been saying is really boards need to be 1, informed, 2, they need to monitor what's going on, 3, get the right advice, and cash is king. Thanks everyone for listening today. As always, please get in touch with us if you've got any questions. You can find our details on the Hall & Wilcox website, and you can find details on the McGrath-Nicol website as well, or connect with us on LinkedIn. If you enjoyed today's episode, then rate, review, or follow our podcasts wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you for joining us.
This podcast is not legal advice and should not be relied upon as such. You should always obtain legal advice about your specific circumstances.